The committee meets today to receive testimony on the posture of United States European Commander. I want to welcome our old friend General Philip Breedlove, the Commander of the United States European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. General Breedlove, I want to thank you and your family for your dedicated service to the nation. This committee relies on the candor of each of those in positions such as yours to conduct the oversight work we're sent here to do. So I especially want to thank you on behalf of this committee for your honest and forthright presentation of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine over the past year. I might point out that each one of your predictions to this committee has been, and to the world, has unfortunately been proven to be true about the actions that Vladimir Putin continues to take in dismembering a sovereign nation. As Ian Brzezinski explained before this committee earlier this week, Europe and the NATO alliance face, quote, challenges on multiple fronts of unprecedented complexity and increasing urgency. To its south, the alliance faces a treacherous combination of state sponsors of terrorism, failed states, and extremist organizations. Already this year, radical Islamists attacked Paris and Copenhagen. Last week in the Mediterranean, over 700 migrants perished tragically in a shipwreck fleeing the conflict and instability of North Africa. And then there's Russia. To its north, the transatlantic community faces Russian militarization of the Arctic, and to the east, NATO confronts Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since the end of the Cold War, U.S. policy toward Russia was based on a bipartisan assumption that the Russian government sought to integrate peacefully into the international order in Europe and to forge a constructive relationship with the United States. The events of the past year have overturned that assumption. Russia became the first state in 7 decades on the European continent to send its military forces across an internationally recognized border and forcibly annex the sovereign territory of another state. Today, Russia maintains sizable numbers of artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers on the territory of Ukraine in violation of the February ceasefire agreement. The Russian military has recently deployed additional air defense systems near the front lines in eastern Ukraine, the highest amount since last August, according to the State Department. It's a disturbing sign that another offensive may be imminent. In response, it is not that the United States and our European allies have done nothing. It is that nothing we have done has succeeded in deterring Putin's aggression and halted his slow-motion annexation of eastern Ukraine. Despite the advice of nearly every statesman and policy expert that has appeared before this committee in recent months, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Madeleine Albright, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and others, and against the advice of both his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States has refused to provide defensive lethal assistance to Ukraine. The Ukrainian people aren't asking for U.S. troops. They're simply asking for the right tools to defend themselves and their country. The President's continued inaction for fear of provoking Russia is seen by Putin as weakness and invites the very aggression we seek to avoid. And it only increases the likelihood this aggression could expand to places like Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states, and Central Asia. Of course, there is no military solution in Ukraine, but there is a clear military dimension to achieving a political solution. As 3 major think tanks wrote recently, and I quote, assisting Ukraine to deter attack and defend itself is not inconsistent with the search for a peaceful political solution, and it's essential to achieving it. Only if the Kremlin knows that the risks and costs of further military action are high will it seek to find an acceptable political solution. Ultimately, we must recognize that we are confronting a challenge that many had assumed was resigned to the history books, a strong, militarily capable state that is hostile to our interests and our values and seeks to overturn the international order in Europe that American leaders of both parties have sought to maintain since World War II. U.S. strategy and military posture in Europe should adjust to reflect this harsh reality. Yet, as Russia builds up, America draws down. The Obama administration eliminated 2 heavy brigades stationed in Europe in 2012. Yesterday, the Army announced the departure of 24 Apache helicopters and 30 Black Hawk helicopters from Germany. And we'll want to hear more from General Breedlove on the plan for a rotational presence and other efforts to reassure our allies. As Admiral Stavridis, the former SACEUR and EUCOM commander, told this committee on Tuesday, since the end of the Cold War, we're down 75% in personnel, we're down 75% in the number of bases we have. We have, in my view, come to a line that we should not continue to diminish that presence further. I'm also concerned about the fact that too many of our NATO allies continue to fail to provide for their own defense. Despite promises at the Wales summit to reverse the trend of declining defense budgets, soon Poland and Estonia may be the only other allies meeting our alliance's commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. In response to the broader challenge that Russia poses to security in Europe, it's not that the United States and NATO have done nothing. We have created a modest rapid reaction force, increased air policing and sea patrols, expanded training and exercises, and deployed small numbers of additional forces to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The problem is the actions we have taken seem inadequate to the scope, scale, and seriousness of the challenges we face. None of us want to return to the Cold War, but we need to face the reality that we are dealing with a Russian ruler who wants exactly that. The reason for maintaining a U.S. strong military presence in Europe is the same as ever, to deter conflict and aggression. But we must revisit the question of what it will take to achieve this goal when confronting a revisionist Russia that is undergoing a significant military modernization and that is willing to use force not as a last resort, but as a primary tool to achieve its neo-imperial objectives. I hope today's hearing will help us to better understand the magnitude of the challenge we face in Europe and what to do about it. I thank General Breedlove for joining us today and look forward to your testimony. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and General Breedlove, welcome. Thank you for your many years of service, you and your family, and please pass along our gratitude to the servicemen and women of the U.S. European Command for their great service. Let me also thank the Chairman for holding an excellent hearing on Tuesday with witnesses from outside the government on the security situation in Europe. That hearing, along with today's hearing, will help inform the committee's markup of the annual defense authorization bill. I must also say that the series of hearings that the Chairman has prepared over the course of this session has been extremely useful by having policy experts and then the relevant commanders come in. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've really enhanced this discussion and our insights. General Breedlove, you have responsibility for maintaining the critical transatlantic relationship with Europe. As our witnesses on Tuesday emphasized, Europe does indeed matter for United States national security. Our European partners have made and continue to make significant contributions to coalition operations in the Middle East and South Asia. Our longstanding basing arrangements in Europe provide vital support to operations in CENTCOM and AFRICOM, and NATO remains a critical component of U.S. security based on its members' shared values and interests. Today, EUCOM confronts a range of challenges in or around the European area, many of which have just recently arisen. Foremost is the threat from an increasingly confrontational, antagonistic Russia, which has revived old fears of a divided Europe. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has challenged the post-Cold War vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. EUCOM is leading efforts to respond to the hybrid warfare tactics used by Russia in seizing Crimea and secretly supporting separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. EUCOM and NATO have sought to counter Russia's false narrative on Ukraine, highlighting the continuing flow of heavy weapons, Russian military leadership, and training to the separatists in violation of the Minsk ceasefire agreements. General Breedlove, we would be interested in your assessment of the security situation in Ukraine and whether you believe heavy fighting is likely to resume in the coming weeks, as some are predicting. From early in the Ukrainian crisis, EUCOM has been working with the Ukrainian government to identify military and security shortfalls and advise on building Ukraine's capability to defend itself. There is broad support in this committee and in Congress for providing Ukraine military assistance, including lethal defensive weapons necessary for it to defend itself against further attacks. As discussed at Tuesday's hearing, any arming of Ukraine involves risk and needs to be done carefully and thoughtfully. But as a recent report by several leading think tanks concluded, assisting Ukraine to deter attack and defend itself is not inconsistent with the search for a peaceful political solution. It is essential to achieving it. EUCOM has also played a critical role in reassuring our NATO allies closest to Russia. EUCOM has increased the presence on a rotational basis of U.S. military forces in Eastern Europe on the land, sea, and in the air. At the NATO-Wales Summit, members approved a readiness action plan and other steps to strengthen the alliance's capability to come to the aid of a member whose security is threatened. One issue I hope General Breedlove will address is whether U.S. forces in Europe are postured to deter further Russian aggression, and whether this mission can be carried out over the coming years through the use of U.S. forces rotating into the European theater from bases back home. Ultimately, much will depend on whether NATO members fulfill their Wales commitments to achieve defense spending at a level of 2% of GDP in the coming years. The budget request includes nearly $800 million on top of the $1 billion approved last year for the European Reassurance Initiative to enhance the U.S. military presence and activities in Europe. EUCOM also must contend with security challenges along Europe's other borders. The transit across the Mediterranean of tens of thousands, possibly more, migrants fleeing instability in Libya, Syria, and Eritrea, and elsewhere has overwhelmed countries in southern Europe. Efforts to respond to this crisis have been mixed to date, and clearly more must be done soon, as the violence and instability in Libya and elsewhere continues unabated. To the southeast, Turkey's porous border with Syria continues to attract foreign fighters traveling to the Syrian conflict and back, heightening the risk of future anti-Western attacks like those in Paris and Brussels, and adding to concerns about a rising ISIL presence in European cities. In the north, Russia's expanding militarization of the Arctic is potentially at odds with international efforts to promote cooperation and increase economic activity in this region. This is a long list. We look forward to your testimony, and thank you for your service.
Welcome back, General Breedlove. Thank you. Please proceed.
Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. It is an honor to be here representing the dedicated soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, civilians, and the families, as you have both mentioned, of the U.S. European Command. Thank you for all you do to support them as they serve our nation. Compared to just 1 year ago, Europe faces a very different and much more challenging security environment, one with significant, lasting implications for U.S. national security interest. Our top concern, as both of you have mentioned, is a revanchist Russia. Russia is blatantly challenging the rules and principles that have been the bedrock of European security for decades. This is global, it's not regional, and it is enduring, not temporary. Russian aggression is clearly visible in its illegal occupation of Crimea and its continued operations in eastern Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia has supplied their proxies with heavy weapons, training and mentoring, command and control, artillery fire support, tactical and operational level air defense, among others. Russia has transferred many pieces of military equipment into Ukraine, including tanks, armored personnel carriers, heavy artillery pieces, and other military vehicles. What we have seen over the course of the fight was that when the Russian proxy offensive would ever run into trouble, Russian forces intervened directly to right the course. Today on the ground, the situation is volatile and it's fragile. Russian forces used the opportunities provided by the recent lull in fighting to reset and reposition while protecting their gains. Many of their actions are consistent with preparations for another offensive. The hope remains that both parties will fully implement an effective ceasefire as an important step towards an acceptable political resolution of the conflict, one that represents the internationally recognized border. I'm often asked, should the United States and others provide weapons to Ukraine? What we see in Russia is an aggressive application of all elements of national power, diplomatic, informational, economic, as well as military. So in my view, it would not make sense to unnecessarily take any of our own tools off the table. But the crisis in Ukraine is about more than just Ukraine. Russian activities are destabilizing neighbor states and the region as a whole, and Russia's illegal actions are pushing instability ever closer to the boundaries of NATO. We cannot be fully certain what Russia will do next, and we cannot fully grasp Putin's intent. What we can do is learn from his actions, and what we see suggests growing Russian capabilities, significant military modernization, and an ambitious strategic intent. We also know that Putin responds to strength and seeks opportunities in weakness. We must strengthen our deterrence in order to manage his opportunist confidence. At the same time, Europe also faces the challenge of a surge in violent extremism. European nations are rightly worried about foreign fighters returning home to Europe from the fight in Syria and Iraq, with new skills and with malign intent. Attacks like those in France, Belgium, and Denmark are only likely to become more frequent. Foreign fighters are part of a much broader pattern of insecurity to Europe's south, with roots in the Middle East and North Africa. Transit routes are shared by violent extremists, organized criminal networks, and migrant populations fleeing difficult conditions in Libya and other undergoverned spaces. The spread of instability into Europe and the transnational terrorism we all face could have a direct bearing on the national security of the U.S. homeland. EUCOM is working with European nations bilaterally and supporting NATO alliance initiatives to meet and counter this new and more complex security environment. Based on the decisions made at NATO's Wales Summit last year, the alliance is adapting in order to improve its readiness and its responsiveness. The Readiness Action Plan, or RAP, is well underway. Our allies are stepping up, making contributions that give them a real stake in the outcome. The United States will have a key and sustained role to play in supporting and enabling these changes, especially in critical areas that are hardest for our allies to provide, like lift, sustainment, and enablers such as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. At the same time, our own U.S. efforts in Europe remain essential. Our leadership is perhaps more important now than at any time in recent history. Since Russian troops illegally occupied Crimea last year, U.S. forces under the banner of Operation Atlantic Resolve have continued to take concerted steps to assure allies of our commitment to their security and to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the common defense cornerstone of our transatlantic security. EUCOM air, land, maritime, and special operation forces have maintained presence in all three of our NATO allies in the Baltics, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, as well as the Black Sea, providing an array of capabilities including airborne armor, mobile infantry, light fighter, strike fighter, advanced air, and maritime presence, in addition to training, advising, and exercising with host nation forces. You have made most of this persistent presence possible through your support of the European Reassurance Initiative, or ERI. The assurance measures it supports enable the alliance to remain strong and cohesive in this new security environment. In facing both of these serious challenges to Europe's east and to its south, EUCOM is working closely with many others, our sister COCOMs, NATO, partners, as well as allies and other international organizations, including the European Union. There is plenty of work to go around, and our collaboration and our unity are essential. EUCOM is also drawing heavily on great new efforts underway in the Department of Defense, not the least the Defense and Innovation Initiative, which applies cutting-edge approaches to some of the toughest challenges in our theater, like anti-access area denial. The strong threat posed by Russia and the growing challenge to the south lead me to three areas where EUCOM could particularly use your help. First, sufficient persistent forward presence. Our forward presence in Europe is the bedrock of our ability to assure allies, to deter real and potential adversaries, and to be postured to act in a timely manner should deterrence fail. It was our permanent presence in Europe that gave EUCOM the ability to respond immediately after Russian troops illegally occupied Crimea. Soldiers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Germany deployed to the Baltic states and Poland within 96 hours of receiving their mission. And our F-15s from Lakenheath, England, began flying missions out of Poland within 18 hours of being given the mission. That same permanent presence ensures that EUCOM can play a full array of essential supporting roles for other combatant commands, from neighboring AFRICOM and CENTCOM to STRATCOM and TRANSCOM. Rotational presence is not a substitute for permanent forward presence in building relationships or signaling our commitment, but a fully funded rotational presence can play an important role in helping meet the requirements in our theater if it is heel to toe and properly resourced. The second area is sufficient intelligence support. Since the end of the Cold War, our nation's community of Russian area experts has shrunk considerably, and intelligence assets of all kinds have been shifted to the wars we've been fighting or to understanding potential future threats. Russian military operations over the past year in Ukraine and the region more broadly have underscored that there are critical gaps in our collection and analysis. Some Russian military exercises have caught us by surprise, and our textured feel for Russian involvement on the ground in Ukraine has been quite limited. Earlier indications and warning and the ability to better understand Moscow's thinking and intent are absolutely critical for avoiding future surprise and miscalculation, for deterring effectively, and for preparing to respond if required. Getting this right requires more ISR, high-power analytical support, and appropriate intelligence sharing with allies and partners. The same holds true for effectively waging counterterrorism and counter-ISIL operations in and through the European theater. A small investment in this capability could lead to a large return in our understanding of the complex challenges we face. Third and finally is sufficient future resourcing. In the near term, EUCOM's particular request for your support for European Reassurance Initiative for fiscal year 2016 is important. Your support for ERI in 2015 demonstrated commitment to our allies, increased our ability to shape the European theater, and allowed EUCOM to build and sustain the capacity of our allies and partners. The request for ERI in FY16 builds on this initiative. Key components include maintaining air superiority presence, participating in NATO exercises, supporting the rotational presence of an armored brigade combat team, pre-positioning equipment, funding the Global Response Force exercises, and fostering SOCUR engagement with partners and increasing Guard and Reserve participation across the theater. We understand these assurance measures come at a cost, and in the current budget environment, additional cost means making tough decisions. As a result of previous constraints, our EUCOM readiness has already assumed greater risk. Specifically, our deployment timelines are longer, our preparations are less robust, and our fundamental ability to deter and defeat in a timely and effective manner is less sure than it was a decade ago. As Secretary Carter testified recently, further reductions would damage our national security and have a direct and lasting impact on our ability to protect and defend the nation in and from the European theater. Meanwhile, the security challenges in and around Europe are growing sharper and more complicated. Your support for EUCOM's mission and your tireless efforts to chart a long-term path toward resourcing a strong national defense are critical steps to ensuring the enduring ability of EUCOM and DoD to protect and defend this great nation. From the dedicated men and women serving in our European theater, thank you. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I now look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, General. Item of business, quorum is now present. I ask the committee to consider once via nomination and a list of 361 pending military nominations. First, I ask the committee to consider the nomination of Mr. Peter Levine to be Deputy Chief Management Officer, Department of Defense. Is there a motion to favorably report? Is there a second? All in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Finally, I ask the committee to consider a list of 361 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee the required length of time. There's a motion to favorably report these 360. Is there a second? All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed The motion carries. Thank you, General, and thank you for your final remarks about the situation that will evolve if we continue with sequestration. I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, Chairman, it is.
And that would seriously impair your ability or our nation's ability to carry out our responsibilities in Europe.
That's correct, Chairman, and challenge our forward presence.
And put the lives of the men and women who are serving in the military in greater danger.
Yes, Chairman.
Thank you. Very quickly, literally thousands of refugees, migrants are fleeing North Africa and trying to arrive in Europe. In some cases, that's not too great a distance. Wouldn't it be logical for terrorist organizations like ISIS to maybe place some people on those boats and transport them to Europe?
Chairman, this is one of our great concerns and also one of the great concerns of our allies.
Have we seen any indication of that so far?
Chairman, I can't talk to specifics, but I will look into that and get back to you. I have not seen specific named reports yet, but we are following several threat streams.
I get the impression from your testimony that, as you have in the past, you are predicting that we're in a period of pause with the Russians in eastern Ukraine, and it's very likely within a certain period, relatively short period of time, they will mount additional, the quote, separatists will be mounting further conflicts in the region, in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. Is that accurate?
Chairman, I cannot accurately predict what they'll do, but I can watch what they have done in the past and what they have done in this lull, as you correctly describe. During this lull, we have seen a period of what I would call resetting and preparing, training, and equipping to have the capacity to again take an offensive.
So they aren't doing all of what they're doing now for nothing?
In the past, they have not wasted their effort.
In January, we had a hearing, and Secretary Albright was there, and Schultz and Kissinger, and all of them said that they believed we should provide defensive weapons to the Ukrainian government. I asked Secretary Carter in his nomination hearing. He said, I am inclined in the direction of providing them with arms. The list goes on. And I'm not asking you to make policy. And so I will phrase my question in the way, wouldn't it have a significant impact on the military situation in eastern Ukraine today if we gave the Ukrainian military the weapons that they so badly need defensively?
Chairman, first of all, I agree with the Secretary of Defense. And I believe that, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that our Mr. Putin and his forces have taken and used every tool to their great advantage, to including the military tool. And as you have phrased, it is important that we should consider all those tools, and I support the consideration of using offensive weapons to change decision calculus on the ground and to facilitate bringing our opponent to the table for a solution, a final solution.
I have the impression that our European allies are reluctant to impose serious sanctions or seem to be seeking ways to lift sanctions is directly related to their dependence on Russian energy. You think it would be helpful if we developed a strategy for getting energy to our Eastern European friends, particularly Ukraine, but also Eastern Europe and even Germany?
Chairman, first of all, I completely agree with your premise. As I said, Russians use every tool, and this economic tool of energy, using energy as a tool or a weapon, is clearly a part of the calculus that is affecting the decision of many of our allied nations. And any efforts we would take to make Europe more energy independent from Russia would help in this calculus. I agree.
What do your European friends say when we admonish them that all but two of them are spending less than 2% of their GDP on defense? It seems to me that they don't have much of a sense of alarm.
Chairman, there is good news here, and there remains concern here. We do see several of the nations in the last weeks setting a plan to achieve 2% spending. Those numbers are still small, but we see nations doing that. We see a few nations committing to, in the short term, getting to the NATO average, which is below 2% and not the goal that we have asked them to set. So at least there is a commitment to turn around a decline. But there is concern about the spending. I would say that to the positive side of the ledger, as you know and we have talked about, many of these nations are stepping up and putting their forces where they're required in our readiness action plan, in the very high readiness joint task force, committing as European nations to be centerpieces of that very high readiness task force. So I don't want to gloss over the challenge. We need to remain focused on the spending and our pledges that all the nations made at the Wales Summit, and we will be continually focused on that.
Thank you, General, and again, thank you for your service and, frankly, for your very forthcoming responses to the questions of this committee. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, just a point of clarification. I think in response to Senator McCain's question, you talked about offensive weapons. Is that?
Senator, yes, I have been steady on the record as saying that I believe all our tools should be considered.
Very good. Let me follow up also on Senator McCain's questions about the potential flow into Europe and beyond of foreign fighters, particularly coming from the Maghreb and the Middle East. That is essentially a law enforcement problem at this juncture, and I would assume that you're collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security, with the FBI, and with all our law enforcement. Is that the major thrust of
Sir, I would broaden the answer a little bit. The short answer to your questions are yes, and in fact, we have on our staff in EUCOM representatives of law enforcement agencies and others, and a director that we created for just this problem in our J9. But if I could just broaden the answer just a little bit, the example of Operation Ocean Shield off of the Horn of Africa, and the example of Kosovo, the EULEX mission from the EU, and NATO's KFOR mission are great examples of where EUCOM is able to work with other agencies in Europe, and where NATO is able to work with other agencies in Europe. NATO brings a great command and control, military structure, and military discipline to the problem. So in Ocean Shield, they took care of the sea approaches to the Horn. And then the EU has that great all-of-government, more Ministry of Interior connections to judiciary, to policing, and others. And so the combined excellence of NATO military with the European Union's ability to reach ashore and do, these nexuses are where I think we have a lot of good to do in the future to problems like the foreign fighters that both you and the chairman have identified.
But part of this is being able to rely upon Homeland Security, FBI, et cetera, and in the same context of your issue with sequestration, if these departments fell under sequestration, if they had limited resources, that could materially affect your ability to stop this threat?
This is a broad response required across those agencies as well as military agencies, Senator.
Thank you. Let me ask folks on Ukraine. There are several dimensions. The two most significant, the operational readiness of the Ukrainian military forces and the economic reforms that they have to undertake to literally survive. I think we had a chance to talk about this in the office. Sure. Can you give us your, we focus significantly on situation of weapons, but what are the top sort of items that they need to be operationally capable of resisting? It's not just weapons, it's a list, and in fact, you might sort of prioritize the list.
Senator, thank you for the opportunity to talk to this, and I would just open by saying that we have what is called the Ukraine Commission, the Joint Commission, where our EUCOM soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have done a series of bilateral visits and worked with the leadership of the military and their ministries to do exactly what you talk about, which is to identify their needs in this business. We did many of those visits before the Russian offensive last August. So we had to go back and redo a few because that Russian offensive seriously altered the complexion of the Ukrainian military. So we have done a very exhaustive series, about 25 visits, and we have done exactly as you have described. We have outlined things that we think are important. I think the top three bins in a purely military sense, not a political or economic sense, are first of all in communication and counter-communication. The Russian forces were able to take the Ukrainians off the air in certain areas, heard them by turning off military communications onto their cell phones, and then used their cell phones to attack them on the field. So the ability to communicate and also defend against counter-communication, sort of item one. Item two in a group is what I call counter-battery capabilities. About 70% of the Ukrainian casualties and deaths have been to Russian and separatist artillery. And so I would put in the second group of capabilities and capacities that we need to work with them on is that counter-battery and how to survive artillery fire. And then the third is a broad range that I call counter-mobility. The Russian forces and the separatist forces in the east enjoyed a wide range of armored capabilities that have been supplied by Russia, and the ability for the Ukrainians to address that capability is important. So those are the three broad areas that I think are probably the key. And what I would say also, Senator, in closing, is that what we found in our visits with our disciplined approach to this is pretty close to what President Poroshenko and others are asking for as they talk back to us, Senator.
Just a final point. I know this is out of your field, but if the economic reforms from both a quality of life and the politics and the willingness of the Ukrainian people to support the government are absolutely critical, and if they fail at that, that would have as significant consequences beyond just sort of a further aggression by the Russians.
Senator, as you know, I'm in and out of Ukraine, and as I have talked to both the President and the Prime Minister, they were both elected under a format of reform to economic and also getting at corruption. They both know they have to deliver, and this is important. And it's hard to deliver on that kind of reform when you're in the field fighting. We need to get that fighting over so that they can begin to address the issues that their electorate put them in office to correct.
Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General, I really appreciate not only your testimony, which lays out the significant challenges that we have, that your combatant command faces, but also how forthright you've been not only in testimony, but also in public statements. I think you've been a real leader for our country in terms of telling it like it is, in terms of what the challenges are and what we can do. I want to dive deeper into what the chairman mentioned at the outset of his remarks. One of the aspects of Russia's activities is the militarization of the Arctic. And I have a map here. I'm going to pass it out to my colleagues. But it's a pretty informative map of how the Russians are militarizing the Arctic. That's a new Arctic command, as you know, 4 new Arctic brigades, 11 new airfields, a huge icebreaker fleet, land claims that they're making now in the Arctic, increased long-range air patrols. And General, you and I have talked about their recent Arctic exercise, which I think caught a number of people by surprise. 38,000 troops, close to 3,400 military vehicles, 41 ships, 15 submarines, 110 aircraft, lasted 5 days and included long-range destruction of simulated enemy land and naval units as the mission. You talk about the COCOM seams in your testimony, and the Arctic, in my view, is a classic place for the COCOM seams, the EUCOM, PACOM, NORTHCOM. What do you think the Russians are up to, and do we need an Arctic O plan that can help us coordinate efforts between the different seams that we have in our COCOMs?
Senator, thank you for the opportunity to comment on an important issue, and I share many of the concerns, all of the concerns that you identified. One would hope that we could see what is happening in the high north as an opportunity. Economically, that shorter route, even if it's only for several months, a year, saves lots of money and would make for a great push to all of our economies. And
it's going to be an important route, and there's a lot of resources there. Is that what you think the Russians are doing? What are they doing?
So, Senator, I think they are, to your concern, making sure that they have the military infrastructure to be able to influence the high north. Of course, their words are that this is all in a peaceful manner. And again,
Pretty big military exercise to be in a peaceful manner.
Yes, sir. We have to watch their actions and see if we can derive their intents from those. But to the seams, Senator, the good news here is that we recognize those seams. Admiral, as I call him, Shortney Gortney, and I have been friends for many years, and we have met recently on this very issue. And we have an initiative called the Russia Strategic Initiative, where all of the COCOMs who touch Russia have come together, and EUCOM will lead an effort that we make sure we don't have any seams in the way.
Do you think we need an Arctic O plan, though, to help address that and know what the requirements are in the Arctic and other places?
Sir, if you would allow, that's more of a policy way ahead.
In your personal opinion, do you believe that we...
I think it's important that I am aligned well with the other COCOMs and how we would address the North.
Let me ask another more specific question. You know, the Army is contemplating removing not one but 2 BCTs from Alaska. If you look at the map there, you show it certainly shows how important that strategic location is. Many military officials have testified in front of this committee that they think that would be a bad strategy in terms of the signal it would send, our readiness. In light of your testimony that Putin responds to strengths and weaknesses, and that a critical element of our strategy is a persistent forward presence, and that your PACOM counterpart is focused on a, quote, rebalancing of forces to the Pacific, in your personal opinion, given all of these items, do you think it makes sense to reduce one Army soldier in Alaska, let alone 1 or 2 entire BCTs, particularly our only airborne BCT in the entire Pacific and the Arctic? And what do you think Mr. Putin would think about us removing 1 or 2 BCTs from the Arctic at this time when he's certainly trying to muscle his way into there?
Senator, the Alaska and the forces in Alaska are critical to our approach to Russia. You rightly recognize that this is a strategic area and an important area, and Putin will be watching. I don't mean to be flip, but it's an important area for General Breedlove because his young daughter and serves in this service as well and will soon land in Alaska to serve for the next 3 years.
Oh, we'll be glad to host her.
So, Senator, this is important, and the signature that we have there to be able to respond is important. I know that the Army is facing some physics problems as it relates to funding, and I'm not tracking their thought process there, but I do believe it is important that we keep the right capabilities to address aggression in the North.
Should we remove 1 single soldier from Alaska right now?
Sir, I would ask maybe that the Pacific Commander would be better positioned to answer that. I would not recommend reducing our capabilities in the North.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General Breedlove, for your testimony today. I want to talk about a different seam. I'll pick up on Senator Sullivan's talking about the seams, the seam between EUCOM and AFRICOM. You talk about your eastern flank challenges and your southern flank challenges, and a number of the southern flank challenges are because of instability in Africa and North Africa. And I think it's important for the committee just to kind of be reminded, EUCOM and AFRICOM share a lot of resources, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And the resources that you share are getting pretty stretched, because just as you talk about increasing challenges in the EUCOM region, if General Rodriguez were here, he would talk about the number of increasing challenges in AFRICOM, whether it be Boko Haram, Lord's Resistance Army, ISIL or Al-Qaeda, splinter groups, Al-Shabaab, AQIM. He would be singing the same tune about increasing challenges, correct?
Yes, Senator, and I think there's just a couple of things to mention here that are good and challenges. First, with AFRICOM, we have an authority that COCOMs have never had in the past. The Secretary of Defense has given us the authority at the COCOM level to share forces quickly and easily when required, and the two commanders agree that those forces should be shared, and this process works very well between Rod Rodriguez and myself and our staffs. That's good. But to your other point, sir, I would like to seize on that just a moment. Our forces in Europe, which I share with General Rodriguez, have been sized over the last 2 decades for Russia that we were looking to make a partner. And so our forces have come down, as was described in the opening remarks, drastically since the end of the Cold War. And our headquarters size has come down drastically across the past few years. We are now the smallest COCOM headquarters in the military. And so now we do, as you correctly point out, we face literally what I call 3 new missions and 3 new threats. First and foremost, as we described earlier, a revanchist Russia, which we're not sized for. Second is this entire problem that the ranking and the chairman both spoke to, of this flow of migrants and other people out of the undergoverned spaces in North Africa. And then third is this Iraq, Syria, Levant problem that could lap over our great ally to the east, Turkey's borders, and become a problem. And so our forces in Europe were not sized for any of those 3 challenges.
And if I can just sort of summarize, you were not sized for these challenges. You share resources with an AFRICOM that is also seeing a significant uptick in challenges, and you're dealing with the potential reality of a budget sequester that would impose an even tighter tightening of the belt at the very time when the challenges are increasing. So this has got to be something that keeps you up at night.
It is, Senator, but I again want to say that the Joint Staff and OSD are beginning to address those issues. As you know, we have begun again with the support of the ERI. We have started a firm rotational force, and we're looking for continued support of that rotational force in the next year. And then the Army has committed and has shown signs of building that then into their 17 budget and beyond. These rotational forces will be key to addressing the shortfalls that we talked about, Senator.
I want to switch for a minute. You talked about using all the tools at our disposal. The tools that we most often talk about on this committee or in the Foreign Relations Committee are 3 of the 4. You used the DIME acronym: diplomacy, information, military, economic. We talk a lot about diplomacy, we talk a lot about military, we talk a lot about economic. We don't talk much about information. Talk about the information offensive that Russia is using, and how weak or modest are the efforts that we are putting on the field to counter it.
Senator, we are facing a dedicated, capable, and very lively information campaign from Russia. They are in all of the spaces, from printed to internet to TV, and they are in those spaces in a dedicated and capable way. I will use a number that I have seen reported and in the papers. I do not know it to be true, but Russia has put over $330 million, we think, into these campaigns in the very recent past in order to win these spaces. And their TV capability into our northern Baltic nations is very impressive. It's very good TV. It draws people to listen and then the message is passed.
And what are we doing to counter that?
So we are we are in a very beginning stages of organizing to get after this. The Department of State has a dedicated team now. I will meet with that team next Monday here after the weekend to discuss how we in Europe can move forward in this business. We do have capability in some of our special forces to help teach and train nations to deal with this challenge, and we are doing that. Our Special Operation Forces are working with the capitals in our allied nations, and now also our NATO forces are beginning to look at these challenges as well.
I think that's a big challenge ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Breedlove.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General, for joining us today. In September of last year, NATO allies agreed at Wales to, among other things, quote, reverse the trend of declining defense budgets, to make the most effective use of our funds, and to further a more balanced sharing of costs and responsibilities, close quote. Now, between 2001 and 2013, the U.S. share of total allied defense spending increased from 63% at the outset to 72% at the end of that period. While allies have decreased their spending on average by 20% since 2008, according to the Congressional Research Service. So I've got a couple of questions for you that relate to this. First, do you think increased military investments by our European allies, both individually and also collectively, would likely help us deter Russian aggression? And also, how do you think a more balanced sharing of costs and responsibilities might impact U.S. national security and also its fiscal interests?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And I must agree with all the facts. These are straightforward. We are concerned about our allies' spending. It was a big part of the discussion at Wales. And yes, our nations did, as you described, pledge that by 2024, a decade, they would reach 2%. As I mentioned earlier, we see nations now, a few of them, I think as many as 5 have now made a pledge to increase their spending, but this is a slow process, and the nations that are closest to the problem are more apt now to be forward in their increased spending. But we do see other large nations, even today, news of a large nation committing to increase spending. Will an increased investment deter? Not if spent unwisely. But if we increase investment across all of our allies and invest in those capabilities that do add to our military deterrence value, yes, it can make a difference. And I think that's what you see, Poland leading the way, increasing their spending and increasing their spending in targeted areas that they knew not only they needed, but the NATO alliance needs. And so these are important.
It'd make a difference, and it'd make a difference to us. It would also make a difference toward deterring Russian aggression. And on the point of Russian aggression, so Secretary Kerry, on April 27th, very recently at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, stated that the United States is still willing to negotiate with Russia a series of nuclear reductions that would take us below the New START treaty levels. All of this despite Russia's aggression in Ukraine and despite Russia's violation of the INF treaty announced last year. So let me ask you, do you think that the security situation in Europe today is more stable or less stable than it was before the New START treaty was ratified?
Senator, I would say that the security situation in Europe is less stable, but it's not based on the nuclear piece. That's not what worries me. What worries me is Russia as a nation now adopting an approach that says they can and will use military power to change international borders or take over international states. That's what I truly worry about every day.
And I share that concern, and you're right to be worried about that. And in light of that, and in light of your experience as EUCOM commander and working at NATO, do you think negotiating a new nuclear reduction treaty should be a higher priority for us right now than addressing Russia's violation of the INF Treaty or its aggressive behavior toward its neighbors like Ukraine?
So, Senator, I kind of agree with your construction at the end there. It's very important that we continue to address I think, a lot of people's primary concern, which is this more conventional problem. And your point about the INF, this is very concerning. We do need to address what we all recognize is operations outside of the INF, and we do need to address that.
I see my time's expired, General, and Mr. Chairman, but I cannot fathom a world in which we would see that it would make any sense at all for us to negotiate further nuclear reductions with Russia when Russia is in violation of existing treaty obligations and Russia is behaving the way that it is toward neighbors like Ukraine. I cannot fathom it, and I don't think the American people can support it. And I hope this administration will reconsider that very ill-considered policy. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Generals, for your service and your explaining the complex situation we deal with. Let me ask a question concerning on oil production and basically U.S. Reconsidering, if you will, our crude oil exportation or a ban, removing that ban. The way Russia has been able to use, as far as I'm seeing, and Europe remains heavily dependent on Russia for energy, with 1/3 of the EU oil imports coming from Russia. Do you think we should consider strategically, would it be something that we could look at that would help us with the European allies that we have, if we used our newfound wealth as far as and riches and deposits of energy towards using it from our military standpoint?
Thank you, Senator. As a fighter pilot, it's a little bit out of my league, but I do have some feelings there. The bottom line is that we have clearly seen that Russia uses energy as a tool,
right,
as a weapon, as we talked about in the dime model, in that economic end, threatening, changing, adjusting prices, cutting off the flow of energy has been a tool, and I expect will be a tool in the future. I think that the current drop in oil prices coupled with sanctions have caused a lot of problems for Mr. Putin, and so that may be somewhat diminished now, but clearly energy will remain a tool in the toolkit that the Russian Federation considers, and that efforts that we could make to help Europe and some of our key allies to be more energy independent would clearly aid our concern.
Or less dependent on Russia, and I agree. Next of all, the relationship seems to have degraded to the point to where the Cold War is colder today than it was during the Cold War of yesteryear. I just came back from a conference on Russia and Ukraine in Berlin, and it was very enlightening. And they were both Russian scholars, people who know the Russian thought process. They were saying we should be careful about Ukraine, arming Ukraine. I would have thought, as a West Virginian, we always stand up for the underdog and try to help them. But they said we should rethink that position. You might want to give a thought on that, and you already have on some. But the relationship, what are we doing to build a relationship or a dialogue? I mean, has it deteriorated to the point we're not talking to a country that's extremely powerful as far as in the line of nuclear weapons?
So, Senator, again, thank you. I think that there are places where we're talking a lot. I watch our Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry, work with his counterpart Lavrov a lot. So there are avenues where there is great conversation. I would tell you, sir, what's worrisome is that the military level of conversation has been diminished.
From your standpoint, your cohort, as far as I guess on your level,
Valery Gerasimov.
it's non-existent.
I'll be very distinct in how I answer this. We have a line of communication that works. We know that I can talk to him and he can talk to me. We know that we have the right translators and things.
You haven't had lunch for a while, right?
I haven't had a lot of conversations with him since he
understand.
went into Crimea.
S-300, knowing that we have this conversation going on, knowing that we have a pending outline of a deal, the Iran deal, what did you make of the Russians stepping up and making an announcement in the middle of this negotiations on furnishing S-300s to Iran? How'd you read that?
Senator, I think that this is a tool to influence the conversation, as many other tools have been used in the past to influence conversations. I think that President Putin's first goals are really not about Ukraine. It's about changing the West. Mr. Putin doesn't like to deal with the EU in an economic sense, and he doesn't like to deal with NATO in a military sense. And so many of the tools he used are to try to drive wedges in the EU and NATO. And if he can divide those organizations, then all the other things he needs falls into place. And I think that he uses many tools to force these conversations.
But the P5+1, we're working with him on this whole framework, and here he is, it looks like, undercutting it or basically sending a different message completely. How are we going to trust that he would be part of the P5 if we have to make some decisions or participate?
I agree with your concern.
I have some others, but we'll talk later. Thank you so much, General.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, General. It's nice to see you. As you know, General Rodriguez testified that he thought Libya-based threats have the highest potential of threats in his region to increase risk to the United States and the European strategic interests in the next 2 years. Do you share that concern? And are you satisfied with the response that we have had to that crisis in Libya?
Senator, I am concerned about Libya, and I think as important as a European commander, it's key that I should tell you that many of our key allies are very concerned about Libya. I would say that rightfully so. Our Italian friends are very focused on what's going on in Libya. You know, they are very close to the African continent and are under great pressure from migrations of all manner of people, some of which could be nefarious and some of which could be just legitimate refugees. But what is happening in North Africa and Libya sort of being at the nexus of it right now concerns me and concerns our allies.
You mentioned specifically the Italians. Do you see the refugees that are landing and being transferred into Italy? Are they staying in Italy, or are they moving through Italy to other countries? And if so, what's the response of those countries?
The answer is yes to both. Some are staying in Italy, and some are quickly transiting in the Schengen zone into other nations. And all of the nations of Europe are concerned about these flows because what they could possibly bring. And frankly, they put pressure on all the social systems of these nations.
Have any of our European allies come up with a coordinated strategy in how to deal with refugees, but really more importantly, how are they going to deal with Libya, and are we involved in those conversations?
So first, ma'am, as you know, Italy started out with a military operation of its own, Mare Nostrum, and this operation was tough and consumed almost their entire naval capacity for a certain amount of time. That military operation has been supplanted now by a European Union operation, which is right now being stressed pretty badly by what is happening on the Mediterranean oceans. And you've seen a couple of disastrous results here recently. These are concerns, and the nations are talking about how to handle it and how the nations that are most effective may need other nations' help. It is primarily a conversation inside the EU because this has a lots of reaches into what we discussed earlier. These are, in many cases, Ministry of Interior issues when they come to the land as opposed to Ministry of Defense issues. But the answer, ma'am, is yes, we are talking and we are looking at this problem. And I expect that it will be a growing conversation because this problem will get worse before it gets better.
If I can move back to some of the questions and responses you had on the INF treaty violation that the Russians committed. Have they acknowledged that they violated that treaty yet?
Ma'am, I don't think they've acknowledged. What they continually do when we bring up the INF issue is they point to how the West has busted the INF. They continually point to our missile defenses as being outside of the INF. They point to some of the test missiles we have used in the past, et cetera. So the conversation is we address what we think they're outside of the INF, and rather than answering, they address where they think we're outside of the INF.
So what actions have we taken to date to respond to their violation? Are we being forceful in any way in trying to get the Russians to respond to us in any kind of meaningful way? Or are we going to continue with this back and forth cat and mouse game?
Senator, I actually think that the Department of State and Secretary Gottmuller is pushing pretty hard on this. And that's the first stage of this, is to try to do this through those kinds of conversations. So I am actually maybe a little more optimistic than you sound at this point on Rose Gottmuller's efforts and how she's working it.
I appreciate your comments, and thank you, sir, for your service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I understand you had some discussion with Secretary Sullivan. I had to be at another committee meeting briefly on the question of the Arctic. I'd like to put a slightly different twist on that. 5 of the 8 Arctic nations are NATO nations. Are they taking this seriously? Are they engaged? Has there been communication in terms of NATO's position with regard to the Russian buildup in the Arctic?
Senator, thank you. Yes, our NATO nations are concerned about this. While only 5 or 8 are allies, others are very close partners in the way that we do business. And so the 8 nations, of course, are on the Arctic Council together. The United States took charge of the chairmanship of the Arctic Council this year. We also work closely with Norway and another venue in the Arctic. So there is a consorted concern. Nations are not completely unified in the approach yet, but there is strong conversation about what is it that we do going forward.
Would you agree that one of the things we certainly need to do is infrastructure in terms of things like icebreakers? We're woefully under-resourced in terms of that kind of asset. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
Sir, I have had the same report you have, and we are limited in our icebreaker capacity, and I think it is important that all of the Arctic nations now begin to look at what are our capabilities and capacities to deal with this new environment.
Thank you. To go back to, there was a moment in your opening remarks that caught my attention, and I don't think I wrote it down exactly, but it goes to the question of the Ukrainians and arming the Ukrainians. And you said something to the effect, when the proxy forces run into trouble, Russian forces step in to right the balance. that goes to the heart of my concern about arming the Ukrainians. And the consensus seems to be developing that that's the right thing to do. My question is, does not the principle that you stated in that sentence apply, and that our arming of the Ukrainians would simply provoke a counter reaction from Russia, a kind of escalation? And have you gamed that out? Where does it stop? They're not going to ignore our more direct intervention in terms of lethal arms, and I'd like to know your thinking on that.
Senator, thank you. This is one of the toughest things that we look at and consider, and we are wargaming and tabletopping to work our way through it, because I have been consistent in my remarks and other testimony that, yes, we need to be intellectually honest that anything we do is going to provoke a Russian response. This is the way they do business. And I have also said, Senator, that inaction is also an action, and the Russians will react to it. As I said in my opening statement, Mr. Putin does understand weakness and takes advantage of it. So we need to look at both sides of the ledger, and we are doing that. We have all agreed, and as the chairman mentioned in his opening statement, we do not believe that there is a good course in trying to arm the Ukrainians to the points that they could defeat Russian forces in the field. No one thinks that's the path ahead. What we do believe is that we should consider changing the decision calculus of Mr. Putin, and that's what we look at. And we acknowledge, as you have said, that if we do consider and eventually yes or no on more lethal weapons, it could have a detrimental effect as well.
Everyone around here is trying to psychoanalyze Mr. Putin, but do you believe that his incursion or his support of the separatists in the Ukraine was provoked by Russian national strategy, if you will, of trying to piecemeal rebuild the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or was it provoked by his concern that the Ukraine was moving too closely toward the West? There was talk of joining the EU, talk of joining NATO. In other words, where did all this start? I think, and you mentioned in your prepared testimony that clearly Russia views Ukraine as within their sphere of influence, just as we view Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean as within our sphere of influence, and we would react if there was a movement of those organizations into what would be considered a hostile camp. Do you understand where I'm going with this?
I do, Senator, and I would answer yes to both of your first questions. Yes, this is partially due to the sudden movement as the government changed following the Maidan. That certainly had a part of the calculus. Also, there, as you rightly described,
I think the question is, was that the motivation or an excuse? That's what
I would. The answer is yes to both of those as well. There are those who have said, and I follow the logic that, and it has been reported recently, that Mr. Putin had designs on Crimea long before any of this. You've seen it reported in the press. And so we do believe that he has thought through these possibilities in the past. So none of this was a spur-of-the-moment action, but it could also have been a reaction to what we saw in the change of government following the Maidan. I think what is important to understand is the second part of your two-question pair, which is that Russia does want to have a sphere of influence that buys a buffer zone between them and the West, and they very much see Ukraine as part of that sphere of influence. I've shortened this to a quip that does not, it should not be trivialized, but the bottom line is Russia wants Kiev out of the West and wants the West out of Kiev. And he would like to have Russia driving all of the levers in what happens in Ukraine to maintain that in the future. And I think that's where this is headed.
Thank you, General, for your thoughtful answers, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership on this difficult issue.
Sir.
Thank you.
Didn't he also say on many occasions the worst event of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union? Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, General, very much for being here today, and thank you for your service and your staffs as well. In your posture statement, you stated that one of EUCOM's top three security threats is the flow of foreign fighters between Europe and the Levant. So with that statement, what is the impact to the security of our European allies and to U.S. interests in that region brought by ISIL, al-Nusra, and any number of those other extremist organizations that have been radicalized by them, who benefit from the use of Turkish soil as a means of their lines of communication, that territory for transit, for recruiting, financial services, purchase of goods, weapons. What is the threat there that you see, General?
So thank you, Senator. And it is one of those three sort of threats that have arisen from North Africa, from the Levant, especially Iraq and into, or Syria and into Iraq. And then, of course, Russia was the third. But this is a problem for all of Europe. It is an immediate problem for our Turkish ally because it's on their border, and the possibility of it spilling over into Turkey, the impact of well over 1.6 million migrants, et cetera, et cetera. Turkey is facing direct impact from what is happening there. And we cannot discount that at some, I think it's highly unlikely, let me tell you, but we cannot discount that there might actually be a military incursion across at some time and in miscalculation. So these are things we need to worry about. But the most pressing issue is what you and others have talked about, and that is this flow of fighters, a large number of fighters in Iraq and Syria, and many of them will return with new skills and malicious intent back to their nations. We have seen this already disrupted in a few of the nations. So how do we address that flow? Again, we're in the nascent stage of two very good projects where we are bringing nations together to address this. Those, ma'am, I would need to talk about in a different setting.
Certainly. And the fact or otherwise that Turkey is an ally, I think it could be disputed on any different day. I think there is a lot that goes on through Turkey that we would rather not see happening. And so in your opinion then, is the risk of any sort of action coming through Turkey, would you consider that would be, whether it's ISIS or any of these other organizations, into Europe, would you say that threat is low risk or high risk?
Ma'am, I would not single out Turkey. I think that the flows are in several areas. As we discussed earlier, some of this threat vector may be coming across in this flow into Italy, the diaspora from the Libya area, as these people move freely across the northern Africa and the Maghreb, and they have multiple points of entry into Europe. Turkey clearly has had issues with flows. They are addressing those flows. This is a broader problem than just their borders.
Okay, and that is a good point, General. Thank you. And you mentioned earlier you are a fighter pilot, and thank you for your service in doing that. Could you please describe how important it is to have search and rescue capabilities close to those areas of the fight? We had seen recently, of course, that Turkey refused to allow the United States access to the search and rescue missions or having those types of search and rescue missions out of Incirlik. So could you please describe what effects that has to the combat fighters and those types of missions?
So to the overall question, the first, as a single-seat fighter pilot, we don't allow search and rescue pilots to buy their beers when they're in the bars because their job is incredibly important to what we do. So I'll stop on that one. There is the necessity and the importance of search and rescue cannot be overstated. Ma'am, we have been working with Turkey on some very key things. One I can talk about in this venue, our training and equipping mission is now up and running.
Very good.
So we've made progress there.
Very good.
On the other two, I would like to have someone come by and talk to you
Absolutely.
about progress there.
We will do that. Thank you very much, General, and my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. General Breedlove, can you describe the importance of providing security assistance training to our NATO allies, particularly in Eastern Europe? And is there more that we can do? And I understand that there may be some question about authority to actually provide the assistance that we might want to, and is this something that this committee should be looking at as we look at making sure you have the ability to do what you need to do with respect to training?
So, ma'am, this is important. May I just make a couple of key examples?
Please.
Georgia and Romania. Today, the number 2 and number 4 contributor of forces to Resolute support. The number 2 troop contributing nation to our efforts now, our NATO efforts and U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, is Georgia, a non-ally. We've had a great program with our U.S. Marine Corps in training Georgian troops. And Georgia has gone to Afghanistan during the kinetic fighting, and they've died alongside our forces in the toughest parts of southern Afghanistan, where they fought without caveat. So all of these efforts that we have where we train our Eastern allies and partners, Romania being an ally, and I'll talk to them in just a moment, but these efforts that we have where we train our allies and partners means two things. Their nations draw closer to our Western values and morals and capabilities. And two, as they serve alongside of us, that means our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen do not have to go there in the same numbers. And so it's absolutely key. Romania now, the number 4 contributor to Resolute support, and I think an anchor in the South on the Black Sea, and the things that they're doing in our NATO RAP program, where they are providing a headquarters to lead in the South. So the bottom line is that these allies and partners are incredibly important to us as a nation and an alliance as we address in the future. And ma'am, there are a lot of authorities out there. What we have asked is to be considered to have one created for Eastern Europe. Because we don't compete well sometimes with other places in the world where fighting and things are going on, and that's what we've asked you to consider, ma'am, and we would appreciate your support.
And so just to be clear, this is something that would need to be done through statute, and it's something that we can consider as we're looking at the authorization bill this year.
Yes, ma'am, and if you're interested, we will have the right people talk with your staff.
Absolutely. Thank you. You mentioned in your statement the European Reassurance Initiative, which I think is something that has not gotten a lot of attention, and I wonder if you could assess how it's working, talk a little bit more about what key areas we should be investing in. How is the implementation of this going?
Ma'am, I would never sound like I was correcting. Maybe it doesn't get a lot of interest back here, but let me tell you, in Europe and amongst our European allies, it gets a lot of attention, and it's being used well. We are using this year's ERI to do a myriad of things. Rotational force, the division that has been rotating into our northern nations now, and that rotational Army force funded by the ERI. Bringing aircraft over, such as the A-10s and Camp Terzi and others. These are brought over in these funds. Second of all, if I could show you on a map where all of the investments in infrastructure have been made, you would see a very clear move to the east and the south into our newer nations, providing them with small things that would help us if we had to rapidly reinforce, fixing railheads, fixing landing strips and cargo pads, things that allow us to more quickly join that partner if we had to in the first. And plotted on a map, you would see a string of investments that is demonstratively in the east and in the south to address these new nations. And so the ERI has had a direct impact already, and as you know, ma'am, we have asked for it to be continued in 16.
So you are feeling positive about how it's going, and the response from our European partners has been very positive.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My time is up, but I just wanted to echo the comments that you made about Georgia's contributions to the Afghanistan effort and to support for NATO. I agree. I think they've been a terrific partner and hopefully will continue to be. Thank you, General Breedlove.
Senator
Thank you, General, for your service and leadership. I wanted to ask you if another Benghazi-type attack occurred tomorrow or tonight in North Africa, would European Command be better prepared to respond more quickly and effectively to this type of attack in a region that we see even more activity, more terrorism, and more instability at this point?
Senator, first and foremost, AFRICOM would be better prepared to respond to this attack. And part of the reason AFRICOM would be better prepared is because of our hosting, preparing, training on a day-to-day basis of those forces that AFRICOM would use. As you know, AFRICOM, we share forces with AFRICOM. Our special forces, our airlift forces, our fighters that are on alert are all EUCOM assets, but are at the ready to rapidly support AFRICOM if it goes forward. AFRICOM has been given a special purpose MAGTF crisis response, which we host EUCOM host primarily.
You host that response team, correct?
I do, ma'am.
Yep.
And Morón Air Base in Spain. And today we have several pieces of it deployed forward to be even more ready because of concern.
So the answer would be we'd be in a better position, I hope?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. That's really important. I appreciate that. And one of the questions I wanted to ask about, the Associated Press reported today that Russia has significantly deepened its command and control of the militants in eastern Ukraine in recent months. And this greater level of Russian involvement has evidently resulted in a new term called Combined Russian Separatist Forces. General Breedlove, can you comment on that? Have you seen increased levels of Russian command and control of the separatists, which I think none of us were under any illusion from the beginning that they were controlling these separatists, but it seems that they're upping their game in that regard.
I do agree with that, and I agree with the reporting.
And if that's the case, and we look at what's happening right now, and I know that you were asked earlier about some of Russia's other activities, including its violation of the INF Treaty. You know, one of the things that concerns, I think, all of us is that Russia doesn't seem to be getting the message with the sanctions that are in place alone right now, and with some of the support we're providing in the absence of lethal weapons. So how do you provide assurance to us that we can stop Russia from further destabilizing eastern Ukraine, and that the world understands? I mean, we you know, these separatists are really, we might as well just call them what they are, Russian agents.
Ma'am, it's a broad question, and I'll try to attack it in a couple of pieces here. We do see a very distinct Russian set of command and control in the eastern part of Ukraine, and that, I think, has become necessary for them because there was disunity in some of the earlier attacks. I think the command and control is also required because they are bringing so much capability in there. It needed to be structured, and it needed to be arranged in a way that it could accomplish the goals there in eastern Ukraine. So command and control, air defense, support to artillery, all of these things increased, and making a more coherent, organized force out of the separatists. I've never called them separatists. I've always called them Russian-led separatists or Russian-backed separatists. There is a new term out there. I think that term is being created because it is becoming much more structured by Russian leadership. How do we get them, whether Russia is getting the message or not? There's been a lively conversation about whether what we have done has affected Mr. Putin's calculus. I must admit that in the past I did not think much so, but I do now believe that Mr. Putin is concerned about further sanctions and some of the things, and that may be affecting how he currently does things in eastern Ukraine, but we really have no way of knowing one way or the other.
So can we expect, since we've heard from some of our European partners, including Germany, that they don't believe we should provide lethal weapons, can we expect them to double down on sanctions, at least in terms of where Russia is right now? And I hope that this is something that they don't back off on, and in fact, we increase sanctions.
Ma'am, I really am unable to speak to what our allies are thinking about, but we hear all of these discussions and debates going on now about keeping the pressure on, and I think there is a strong current which says that both sides of the agreement need to be held to meeting this 12 February agreement that was made in Minsk, and that will have a direct bearing on whether sanctions are relieved or not.
Thank you. I think all of us are very frustrated because we've been calling for so long for what needs to be done in Ukraine to push back on Russia. And I just hope that the administration's listening to what we've heard, which has been continuous testimony consistent in this committee about providing lethal support and additional sanctions. Thank you.
Senator McCaskill.
Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the immigration crisis. We now have some of our NATO allies that are down to spending less than 1.5% of their GDP on defense. Obviously, we've had a tragedy that has occurred with hundreds of people going to their death because of their efforts to immigrate to Europe from Africa and parts of the Middle East. Can you tell me in what ways the American military are involved in supporting or working with our European allies as they work to humanely deal with all of the refugees that are attempting to get to Europe?
Ma'am, if I could dissect just a little bit, there is a big problem, as you have identified, with this flow of immigrants across from North Africa into Southern Europe. Probably most acute in Italy, but there is a big problem. We have talked today, and I agree with the supposition that this is primarily an immigration problem, but also inside of these immigrants are organized crime and very likely also terrorists and foreign fighters that are attempting to get across. So this is a problem broader than just the immigration, but certainly that is a major driver. First and foremost, the nations have addressed this, as we talked about earlier. The Italian Operation Mare Nostrum worked this hard, and then the European Union has taken this mission over and now is beginning to work that. Your direct question about what the U.S. is doing, we have a broad NATO network of sharing of information about what's going on the seas, where things are moving. To explain a military term, we have a maritime COP, which is just the picture of what's going on the sea, that we help our neighbors understand and characterize what they're facing.
I just worry that as Italy is, they're spending so little on defense, and if they're using any of their resources to address this, it certainly limits their ability to participate in NATO with us in a more robust fashion. I just am curious if you have any take on the rise of the Scottish National Party and what, if any, impact you see. And if you want to take it for the record, you can, General. It's fascinating to me. These elections are coming in a few days. After they voted to not leave the UK, you're seeing a remarkable surge of political power for the Scottish National Party. And a lot of commentators are now saying that the Scottish National Party is going to be the kingpin in terms of the formation of a government in what is obviously one of our most important allies on the planet. Have you all discussed this? Is this being talked about? It is, Labor is really getting swamped, according to the polling, by SNP. And what impact is that going to have on UK and their robust participation with us as an ally, particularly in NATO?
Ma'am, can I take your generous offer and take that for the record?
Absolutely. What about Europeans leaving to fight for the Islamic State? Are there any specific actions that the European Command is taking to assist the effort of identifying? They have a much bigger problem than we do in terms of citizens of Europe leaving to go and join the fight with ISIS. Is there any specific actions that you all have taken in regards to this problem?
Ma'am, the short answer is yes. Much of that we can't talk about in this room, and I would like to send some of my people to maybe brief you and your staff.
That would be terrific. We would be interested in understanding what our role is in trying to assist in stopping this flow of fighters to these barbarians. Thank you very much, General, for your service, and thank you to your team.
Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for your service. This is a question relating to the U.S.'s rebalance to Asia while threats continue to materialize in other regions. In the case of Russia, which crosses both the European and Pacific Command areas of responsibility, do you see a potential for leveraging our Asia-Pacific posture to influence Russia and its actions in the European AOR, and vice versa? If you can briefly comment, because you did talk about the need to change Putin's decision calculus by, i.e., possibly arming the Ukrainians or further economic sanctions.
Senator, you have hit at the heart of the matter. Russia does touch many COCOMs. Essentially, EUCOM, PACOM, NORTHCOM because of the existential nuclear capabilities, and Alaska and the Northern Passage. Russia also touches many of our specific non-geographic COCOMs, STRATCOM, CyberCom, TRANSCOM. There are so many that Russia touches. We have had a model in the past in Asia that is called the Chinese Strategic Initiative, and it has been a great model to bring focus to the Asia-Pacific area. We have been treating Russia as a partner for many years, and now we see that we're going to have to take the same broad approach in Russia. And so EUCOM has led the formation of a Russia Strategic Initiative where we've brought together all of the COCOMs that touch Russia, and we are working on just these concerns and these opportunities that you mentioned in your question. So yes, we intend to look at Russia more holistically. We've had a great start, and I expect that this will be a good investment of staff time.
So I hope that at some point you might be able to talk with us a bit more about how this strategic initiative with regard to Russia is working out with all of the different commands. You Okay, I think you talked about the U.S. ballistic missile defense, which is very much in high demand. So can you discuss the importance of the European phase adaptive approach and the benefits that Aegis Ashore provides in this approach? And can you also update us on the progress of installing Aegis Ashore in Romania and eventually in Poland?
Let me answer the second part because it's very easy, and then I'll use what time you want to talk more about EPAA. Our two sites, first in Deveselu, Romania, is on course, on schedule to deliver technically on time. We're slightly, and I emphasize slightly because this is a good news story, we're slightly behind in the construction, but the team completely believes that we're on track for the technical handover on time, and we are on or under budget so far, so this is good news. To the site in Poland, we are just this week have signed almost every one of the agreements that are required in order to start that work, so I think we are on track on our site in Poland as well. So these two missile sites will be obviously incredibly important to our missile defense in Europe, and I am way over a glass half full that we are on track with these. To the larger question of European phase adaptive approach, the American contributions are all moving apace. We will close out with our 4th destroyer in Rota this year on time. Our first 2 and now 3rd are already doing their mission. And our connection and our command and control C2BMC capabilities are all proceeding apace. So the U.S. contribution to EPAA is on track. We see where we lead, the Europeans follow. And I think that we see good cooperation now from Europe as they bring alongside what is called ACTS, which is another command and control structure which they have put over not only our air, naval, and our ground capabilities to control these assets. We see several of the northern European nations now, one committing and one thinking about upgrading their Aegis platforms to be able to participate. So the goal in NATO is 28 for 28. Every nation contributes some way. It may just be ground-based defense of a site, but we want all 28 nations involved in this, and I am optimistic at this moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up.
Thank you. Well, along the lines of everyone participating, it seems to me, General, that in talking to European ministries of defense recently and parliamentarians from various NATO and OSCE countries, that there is a realization now among our European allies that they're going to have to do a better job of getting to the 2% GDP. I think I'm learning that the French, for example, aren't quite there, but there's a determination to get to 2% of GDP for defense quicker. So how are we doing with that, without taking my whole 5 minutes, across the board in getting our NATO allies to realize that they need to pony up as we're coming to that realization here in Washington?
Senator, I cannot confirm, but on the way here this morning, I read in the press that the French have announced that they are going to raise their defense spending, and so I don't have any details. It's literally watching the press releases as I came to this. But this is, I think there are several nations that are trending in the right direction here. I must admit that most of them are those nations that are in our easternmost positions in our alliance, but we do have nations, Poland, others that are doing the right thing with their investments. But there are still challenges. The nations made this pledge at Wales, as you know. They gave themselves to 2024 to arrive at that. We see nations moving out now. In general, the trend is...
But we certainly need movement in the right direction well before that.
Sir, I agree completely.
And do you agree, General, that it's not so much our persuasiveness as the reality of what they see and the actions of people that would be our adversaries over there?
That is correct. And Senator, the other piece of this also is that with their forces, they are beginning to do all the right things. Great commitment to the VJTF by 6 of our largest nations, European nations committing to be the center brigade of the VJTF. The United States will not be that center brigade right now, and so 6 European nations.
You know, with regard to the thing that Chairman McCain started out talking about with the supplying defensive weapons to our Ukrainian friends, he noted that Madeleine Albright, Henry Kissinger, Secretary Carter, and I think you said you agree with the Secretary of Defense, have all expressed publicly before this committee support for arming our friends with defensive weapons. And I would simply point out, these are not jingoistic cowboys. You know, they're very thoughtful people. They're some of the most preeminent experts we have, and we have the benefit of their counsel here. It seems to me that with a substantial portion of our NATO friends, there's a nervousness that somehow giving people the ability to defend themselves with defensive weapons is going to be a provocation to Mr. Putin and allow him to gin up his propaganda machine. So could you comment on that? And then I do want to ask you about being caught by surprise with what happened in eastern Ukraine. So if we could squeeze that in my few moments.
Senator, a weapon is a weapon, and whether it's defensive or offensive is sort of in the hands of the beholder of the weapon. But there is, as you have
acknowledged, yes.
Yeah, as you have described, Senator, rightly, there is a conversation inside of our alliance. There are nations that do want to provide lethal weapons, and there are other nations who do believe that this is not the correct approach. It is a lively debate, and my position has been stated.
Well, let me just ask you. To me, it was stunning to hear you admit that we were caught by surprise, and I think you were referring to what happened in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. If we had, and I think you said that right before you advocated a small additional investment in ISR. If we had already had that small investment, would that have prevented us from being caught by surprise by these little green men coming into, men dressed in green uniforms coming into Crimea? And what would we have done had we been aware with better ISR and better intel?
Right. Senator, I'll have to go back and look at the way I use those words. We have been caught by surprise, but mostly it's as it relates to some of these large exercises, like this last exercise that started off being billed as an Arctic exercise. It really turned into a Western military district, Southern military district, and Arctic exercise. And yes, sir, we were caught by surprise for that. In fact, our first tipper to that came from social media, which is an interesting thing. But my concern is that we are in a position where, for all the right reasons, over the past decade and a half, we have refocused our intelligence apparatus, our analysts, our tools on the wars that were going on and on the new threats. And so I blame no one for these decisions. We were focused in areas like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Levant, etc. But what I think we need to consider now, what we as a nation need to consider, is based on the new approach that we see Russia taking to Eastern Europe, we should look at, do we need to refocus any of those assets, be them analyst or actual assets, towards the European program? And I would like to compliment the intelligence community, because they have begun a very dedicated reallocation of analysts to bring to our problem. And I think the problem, and that I have to just absolutely thank them for, but I think that also we need to be rethinking our ISR and other platforms that allow us to have this feel for what's going on in Eastern Europe that we have not considered important for some time now.
Thank you very much. Well, I just commend you, and I'll have to say, apparently the decision makers in this town have decided that we will rebalance toward the Asia Pacific, and that may be the right decision, or it may not. But I cannot think of a troop that's in a hotter spot than you are, and I hope that this Congress and this government understands that the area of responsibility over which you preside is indeed very, very consequential to us right now, here and now. Thank you, sir.
Senator Graham.
Thank you. What's the likelihood, in your view, that Moldova will be in Putin's crosshairs in the next year?
Senator, I think it is an area of his concern and emphasis. I think you are aware, and it's fairly open knowledge, that the forces in Moldova have been retrofitted with new equipment, et cetera, across the past year or so. And we see the sort of interest and rhetoric in that Transnistria region that is concerning, and now we...
Is it kind of almost what we saw in Crimea?
Senator, I don't think it's to that level yet, but it is the leading edge of these kinds of issues.
Do you agree with me it's most likely to occur unless he changes his mind through some recalculation of cost-benefit analysis of what he's doing in the Ukraine right now?
Senator, I agree that I think Mr. Putin is not done in Ukraine.
He's not done in the Ukraine. Moldova may be next. Let's talk about the Baltic states. Can you see a situation, well, is it fair to say that the Russians are trying to stir up problems for the Baltic states with their Russian-speaking population? Is that ongoing right now?
Senator, I think some of the information outreach to these Russian speakers around Eastern Europe, specifically in the Baltics, is searching for the word. It is very good. As we talked about earlier, Senator, before you came.
Good from a Russian point of view.
Sir, exactly.
Bad for us.
Very sophisticated was the word I was looking for, and I couldn't find it.
What's the worst case scenario for the Ukraine?
Senator, I worry a lot about the military problem. I worry almost more about their fiscal issues. We desperately need for Ukraine to be able to address the things that the people of Ukraine voted for in their last election, and that is to reform in a lot of ways, and second, they need to get their fiscal